Welcome to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Today we're going to be looking at how farmers are protecting the environment through management of fertilizers. So stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Farming in Ohio with Chris Bruynis. Chris Bruynis is an extension educator in Ross County with the Ohio State University Extension Program. Chris is going to be talking about how farmers are protecting the environment through management of fertilizers. Chris, it's always a pleasure talking with you. As an extension educator, you have helped many different farmers, many different individuals, not only in Ross County, but in Ohio itself.
You know, I've had the privilege of presenting in 55 of the 88 counties.
Wow.
And so I have traveled around Ohio quite a bit. But, you know, today we really want to focus on this whole idea of fertilizer and applying fertilizer for our growing crops. You know, we here are sitting in the spring of the year, and a lot of times that's when we'll see farmers applying fertilizer out to their fields. And then the other side of that coin is we start thinking about some of the issues we're having in water quality and how fertilizer is tied to that. And so here's a picture from 2001, and in the bottom part of that picture you can see the lime green coloring in Lake Erie there. And that was really a harmful algal bloom event. And, you know, those things are occurring more frequently, and we figured out it's because of dissolved reactive phosphorus that's leaving not only farmers' fields. I mean, we know that farmers' fields contribute, but, you know, septic systems not working well, other discharges that are point discharges also add to that. But farmers really took notice of this. We wanted to do our part and making sure that our water stay clear and clean, and not only for drinkable water, but for recreation. Anybody that lives up around Lake Erie, and you were out there in 2011, you couldn't hardly drive a boat through that. It was so thick. And so, you know, that's not desirable. And then the other side is that we want to think about is Gulf of Mexico. And the Gulf of Mexico is really a nitrogen problem, and that whole hypoxia zone, and we're now trying to shrink that as well. And so farmers need to be cognizant of how they can manage to either use less fertilizer or keep the fertilizer they're using in place on their farms. And so we've done a lot of research over the years, and I think to me that's where we're going with this. And we had, and I don't know how many T is, but 20 sites or so, where we divided fields and we tried different treatments on each side of that field, and we collected the rainwater that ran off the field as well as the tile water that came out of that field, and we tried to figure out what's leaving the field and where is it leaving. So if you look at the top graph, you'll notice that's nitrogen or nitrates, and a high percentage, almost all of the nitrates, are leaving through ground tile. And so now we either have to figure out a way to hold that nitrate, and this is over the winter months mainly. And so when we don't have a crop growing, there's nothing there that uses nitrogen, and therefore the nitrates leach out. And we've known that for years, that it leaches out. We just didn't know the degree. And so now that we know that, we can use cover crops, we can do tile plugs, and so we have management strategies we can put in place. Now, if we look at the bottom one is phosphorus, or DRP is dissolved reactive phosphorus. And you start looking at that, and that red dotted line is kind of what we think. If we can get below that on all fields, the Lake Erie problem is solved. Okay? And so we notice that some fields are doing quite well. Other fields are not. But the interesting thing here is phosphorus is leaving in somewhat equal amounts between water runoff, so a hard rain, will take that and move that across the soil surface, as well as leaching down and going out through the tile. So to get started, now to put your farmer hat on and to get started here, I really think we need to talk about knowing what's in our soil to start with. Not all fields are created equal. Not all fields have the same yield potential. And so, I think we need to start with soil testing. Farmers do a good job of this. We test every 3 to 4 years. Occasionally people will get laxed on this, but we need to come back and say, this is a priority. It is an expense. It does take time to go out there and physically pull a soil sample out of the field and get it into the lab and have it analyzed. And so, but that gives us an index. It gives us a starting point. Do we know how much nitrogen? Well, nitrogen we don't test for, but do we know how much phosphorus and how much potassium is in the soil, as well as what the pH is? And I'm not going to spend much time on pH because lime really doesn't have an impact on water quality at this point in terms of leaching from the fields. And so once we know what's in the soil, it gives us an ability to estimate the probability of a crop response. If we already have a lot of phosphorus, we don't need to add any more. If we're really, really deficient in phosphorus, then we should add to get the crop yield that we need. And we can say, well, why not just not add phosphorus and allow the crop yields to go down? We have more than enough food. Well, we thought that until we had the Russian-Ukraine war, and now the whole international corn and wheat supply and soybean supply is shrinking, and mainly corn and wheat coming out of Ukraine is shrinking. And so, food scarcity is becoming a concern. And so now we need to think about how do we maximize our yields here in the United States without harming our environment. I think that's the challenge that farmers are up against, and I think they'll do a great job. And so we can track over time if we don't do that fertilizer sample every 3 years, and let's say we're trying to build soil up that it's got a very, very low fertility. Well, we can see over time, are we being successful in adding enough to change that? Or if we're, say, it's really, really high and we're trying to lower that amount in the soil, we can track over time. I've got some more slides coming up. But a soil sample is nothing really too difficult scientifically, but we need to take an 8-inch core, and if we go over an entire field, for 20 acres, we want to take at least 20 different cores. Now today, we have some farmers that are sampling every acre and marking it with a GPS mark so that we come back and we sample the exact same spot every time to see how we're doing. So there is field variability. We know that. If we don't take an 8-inch core of soil, distribution of nutrients or fertilizer through the top inch to the bottom inch is not the same. Especially if we've been in farming in a no-till practice, those top 2 inches are going to have a much higher level. But the roots grow in all top 8. Actually, they go below 8. And so we don't want to overestimate or underestimate by taking too shallow. Would tend to overestimate the amount of nutrients available. And if we take it too deep, that would kind of underestimate. And so we want to make sure that we have that 8-inch core. Time of year is also important. Not that you can't take a soil sample any time of the year, but if you look at the graph on the right-hand side of the screen there, we notice, and this is potassium, and potassium is the one that affects the most, does change over time. That in those warmer months of June and July, the readings will be lower than they are in the early spring or during the winter. And we believe that early spring or late winter sample is a more accurate estimate of potassium in the soil and what's going to be available. And so again, if we start thinking about when do we take that soil sample, either early spring or in the fall after the crops have been harvested, but whatever we do, we want to be consistent from one time to the next. So if we do it in the fall, we want to be consistently doing it in the fall, and not the fall 1 year, and 3 years later do it in the spring, and 3 years later do it in the fall, because that's going to mess that accuracy just a little bit. Now, we've done a lot of research through Ohio over the last several years, and they've just released in 2020 the new tri-state fertilizer recommendations, You can download that free, or you can get a print copy. If you're like me, I like to have the book. I'm not a big Kindle reader. I like to have and mark my pages, and so if you want to have it, they are available, $9. You can either order them online directly and have them mailed to your house, or they are available in all extension offices, and there is an extension office in every county here in the state of Ohio. But again, that will give you more guidance on not only the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that I'm talking about today, but micronutrients as well as pH and liming. And so it's an excellent resource. It's not very expensive, and it's something I think every farmer should have in their library. So let's talk about all these on-farm trials. And again, if you look at the counties in red, those are the counties where these on-farm trials were conducted. And you say, well, gee whiz, there's not much in Appalachia where we're sitting at today. Well, the fields are smaller, the equipment is smaller, not always, but as a general trend. And so we're going into those high agronomic production areas, a county that's, 90% of the county is growing corn and beans, versus in a county down here in Appalachia, we have a high percentage that's growing trees. And that's a good crop too, but we typically don't fertilize trees like we do corn and soybeans. And so we're going to look at nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and also sulfur in all these trials. That's what the S is. And we've done it over many soil types. We've worked with farmers, so these are not university, they're university designed, but they're not small plot trials. These are large farm field trials that we've collected data from over the last 14 years. And based on that, and that information is what's went into the Tri-State Fertility Guide, based on that, we really now have changed the recommendations a little bit. We've lowered the phosphorus recommendations, we've lowered the potassium recommendations, and we've also lowered the nitrogen recommendations. And so potassium and nitrogen probably have the most adjustment of the three. But again, we've lowered them all. So research that was done in the 60s is what we were originally using to make that decision, and now we've moved to more current data. And so if our fertility levels in the soil are deficient, then we do recommend building it up to a critical level or a minimum level. And then if it gets above what we call the maintenance limit, if it gets too high, we recommend not adding anything until we draw it back down below that. So we've got a fairly narrow range. It's very prescriptive, and I think that will help our water quality and also protect our yields and our profitability on our farms. And so I just wanted to, don't get lost in the graph here. I think the graphs can be very, very confusing. But what we did is starting in 2006 through 2018, what's on this graph, they added either no phosphorus, or they added the recommended rate of phosphorus, or they added 2 or 3 times the amount of phosphorus, which we know was too high. But if you're not exceeding, you don't know what you're doing wrong either. So for research, and these were 3 of the research farms within OARDC, within Ohio State. And again, if you look at the red line on the bottom, we do realize that if we're not adding any phosphorus, over time the soil phosphorus levels start to decline. And so, if we are too high, we know that not adding it will get us back within that range. That 20 to 40 parts per million is where we would like to be. But it doesn't change fast. I mean, this is 12 years worth of data, and after adding no fertilizer for 12 years, we're still within the range at 2 of the sites, and 1 site we went below. So soil type matters. But adding the right amount, it kind of varies. We're not decreasing any, we're not increasing any. And so, this supports that theory of when to add fertilizer and when not. Now, if we look at potassium, a little bit different story. On all the sites, we seem to be coming down over time. And I don't know if we have a good explanation for that. Without adding potassium, we can lower those potassium levels quickly. And again, this would make me question, is our crop removal rate or our one-time rate adequate, since we still were declining over those years? And, there is a theory out there, is that a function of having greater rain events, that we're leaching more out, whether we need to or not? But then when we go to the yield data, we can look at, is it really affecting yield? And here's our yield data. Here's on phosphorus, plots that we added 0 phosphorus. Again, the red line is 0. And it took a while before we noticed any difference in yield. The top is corn, the bottom is soybeans. If you look at this graph, again, not huge differences. And again, adding the right amount or adding too much, there was 0 differences. They tracked right along with each other just fine. And so now we're looking at a day of high prices. And so, can we reduce our phosphorus applications on our crops and get by for a year or two? This would indicate yes, we can. And so, it doesn't change fast. We look at potassium, you see a very similar story, except in soybeans. On the bottom graph, especially in that middle plot there, we start to see soybean yields drop off quicker than we do corn yields. But again, depending on the soil type, that northwest branch, and we have a lot of crops up in northwest Ohio, that's a tighter clay soil, it doesn't change very fast. And so I think that's probably good news, that we can lower our phosphorus levels in our soils to protect our water quality and do some of our other management practices, such as growing cover crops, tile plugs, minimal till, no till. And so we have a whole toolbox of tools available for farmers, and we're learning how to use those. So the first part we need to do was do the research. I want to talk a little bit about nitrogen, and then we're going to go to questions here, and hopefully you've got a whole set of questions for me. But we're going to go a little bit to nitrogen here, and I'm in economics. That was my master's, was in economics. And so, I'm one of those strange people that loves the economics. And this whole thought of the law of diminishing returns intrigued me, coming off of the family farm, going to college. And, we always talked about the salesmen come around and, if you feed this to your cows, you'll get an extra pound of milk. If you put this on your cornfield, you'll get an extra bushel of corn. But they never stopped to talk about the value of that pound of milk or the value of that bushel of corn was less than what this product that we're wanting you to put on cost. And so, if it costs me more to grow that bushel of corn or that bushel of soybeans or that gallon of milk than it's worth, than I can sell it for, why would I want to do that? And I think we have that same thing with nitrogen. And this is research again over 14 years, looking at 2 sites in the state of Ohio, one up in northwest Ohio, one in western Ohio, that says, if we put no nitrogen on, we still will get corn. And here we start seeing some soil differences. The top graph is western, or the top dotted line. The bottom dotted line is northwest Ohio. But we can still get 75 to 125 bushels of corn without applying any nitrogen. And so the question is, why don't we do that? Well, I think there's lots of answers of why don't we do that. Number one, the amount of food availability across this nation and across the world would decline tremendously. And there'd be a lot of hungry people that would demand that we do something different. Number two, we have priced equipment, land, everything in there that we need to have a certain level of cash flow to afford that, and that wouldn't allow that. So, our farmers would go bankrupt if we used no nitrogen. But now, what is the right amount of nitrogen to use? Well, if we look on both of these farms, you go to about 175. Look between 150 and 200. It kind of plateaus there. Yeah, it still goes a little bit higher, but that's really where we're going to meet that law of diminishing returns, that another unit of nitrogen is going to cost more than the value of another bushel of corn. And so, we're going to look at that 180 at these 2 sites, pounds of nitrogen as the optimal rate of nitrogen. I'm thinking about that, and there is so much difference across soil types. Here in Ross County, I did research with farmers looking at nitrogen rates. It's included in this data set. They've used that information to make these predictions. We had one farm, and it's a very, very good piece of soil. It has high organic matter, and we put on 120 units of nitrogen, 160 units of nitrogen, and 200 units of nitrogen, and we had the exact same yield on each one of those replications. And so there we could get by with less nitrogen. Another farm that I worked with, we put on the same 3 rates of nitrogen, and his maximum profit was at the highest rate. And so, I think we have to think about our own farms, but knowing that the old rule of thumb, and when I grew up, my dad always told me, pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. Well, we're growing a lot of fields in this region and across Ohio are pushing 250, 275 bushels of corn. We are not using that much nitrogen. Now the rule of thumb is about 3/4 to 0.8 of a pound per bushel of nitrogen. So we're getting better. But as we sit today and we think about the price of fertilizer has gone up so much because of the Russia-Ukraine war, that farmers are now saying, gee whiz, instead of paying 50 cents for a unit of nitrogen, I'm now paying $1.05 or potentially more than $1.05. This example, I used $1.05, and the price of corn we put in here at $5.50. I know that I have corn sold for next fall for $6.50, so that's probably a little low. But in this example, there is a model out there, the corn nitrogen rate calculator, and it has all Ohio data in it, and we can go in and we can look at our farm and we can say, okay, what is our yield curve? What is our price of nitrogen? And what does that look like? And so in this example, that law of diminishing returns, we're going to maximize somewhere in that 140 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that tells me right now we're probably going to not have as high a yield as we did last year because we're going to back off on our nitrogen rates a little bit. Now, I did a survey with my farmers in Ross County when we were doing fertilizer certification training, and they told me that they probably were not going to back off much, if at any. They were willing to sacrifice a little bit of loss per bushel, but those bushels at the price they were anticipating would then help cover other bills like land rent, machinery payments, family living that I need to be able to eat too. And so I think that model, it's a great starting point. We can plug it in. It's Ohio data. It'll give us a number. But I think we still need to know our fields. And farmers that have been farming for a long time, they know their fields. I made a comment to you earlier that, the farm that I own, we averaged for the last 5 years 200 bushel corn, 202, 198, but 200 bushel corn. It doesn't make sense for me to go out and say, I'm going to grow 250 bushel corn this year, because that farm has never been able to do that. And so, in time, can we get there? Maybe with better genetics, with improved drainage. There's something else I'm going to have to do to get there besides applying more nitrogen. And so, again, I think we have to be consistent with what we know about our farms, moving that nitrogen application closer to when the plant needs it. And so side dressing we recommend as a strategy to reduce nitrogen. There's less time for nitrogen to volatilize and leach if we're putting it there when the crop needs it and can take it in. And so there are some strategies there. And again, I already mentioned management history and previous performance. I have my email address up there. If anybody does have questions after you watch this, feel free to email me, and I'll try to provide additional information to respond to your question.
We have different animals on our farms, such as turkeys or cows or cattle,
Sure.
Goats, horses, lamb. Do the animals, their organic matter, that since they use that as fertilizers, do they have nitrogen, phosphorus?
Oh, absolutely. And there is a guide available through Ohio State. I forget the exact bulletin number, but it is available. That tells us what the average composition of nutrients are in all those different species manures. And so if we're applying manures, we need to make sure we're counting that and then not applying commercial fertilizer in addition to that, and then we're applying way more than we need. And so, if we have livestock manures of the size and scale that, I grew up on a dairy farm, and we also fed out 350 steers a year, and we covered 200 acres a year with manure. And we valued the nutrients that manure added. But now the other problem that I see with adding livestock manure, a lot of people aren't calibrating their manure spreader. They're going out and they're driving, and it's a waste product. And so oftentimes when we could put 4 tons of manure on, and that would be enough phosphorus for a corn crop, we're putting 36 tons of manure on because we have no idea how much we're putting on. So if we're dealing in livestock manures, calibrating our manure spreader, and the easiest way to do that is to put a tarp down, spread as you would normally spread. We know the area of that tarp, pick it up, weigh it, and then we know what we're getting. And so there are tricks that are easy to do that we can figure out how to do that.
We're talking with Chris Bruynis. Chris Bruynis is an extension educator with Ross County and the Ohio State University Extension Program. I've always found that he will answer your questions as quick as he possibly can. For Farming in Ohio, I'm Patrick Dangle. Thank you, Chris, for a great topic.
Good to be here. We'll see you next month.